to now invite up our final speaker of the evening, who is Alyas Karmani. He is the director of Street UK, who is an organisation that are a specialist in violence prevention, intervention provider, and specifically deal with young people involved in gangs, sexual violence and social exclusion. So I'd like to invite you up, and after that we're going to take a short break where there's going to be teas and coffees available, and we're going to come back into the discussion and the Q&A.
Okay, good evening everyone. Assalamu alaikum. It's really good to be here with you. We've done two events. We did Newcastle yesterday, and I think these events are probably the more important events that I do. We do lots of events all up and down the country with practitioners and with policy makers, and it is a bit tiring and it is a bit frustrating because we see lots of nodding heads, and we hear lots of kind of statements that action will be taken. And I'm a frontline worker. Street is a project, and I know there are individuals here, and I call them unsung heroes. There are people up and down the country who are there on the street working with some of the most damaged young people in our society, with the most compounded vulnerabilities we can imagine. And they are literally lifesavers. That's all I can describe. Unsung heroes who are saving people's lives without any recognition whatsoever. And you know, what's even more frustrating is that, you know, when I talk to agencies talk about their frustration, how they are really challenged in terms of getting out there and engaging young people. They call them hard to reach. We've heard that word already. And the young people I work with, what they say is that we're not hard to reach, we're just ignored and avoided. You know, no one is listening to us. No one engages, no one understands us, no one speaks our language. No one connects with them on a human level, and no one connects with them on that level of we're actually listening to them, understanding them, and making a space for them. And it's no surprise, I say the biggest draw in the world is love and compassion, and the biggest draw is a sense of belonging. And it's really bizarre working with young people, you know, working with a young girl who is being pimped out, trafficked, taken from town to town and gang raped every night. And unfortunately, it's happening tonight. This is beyond the headlines, this is the reality of what we're talking about. It is happening tonight, here in this region, that children will be gang raped by multiple men, by, you know, hardened criminals with organized criminal networks who will take them from town to town and abuse them. Make them drug dependent. There will be not just a threat of violence, there is real physical violence and intimidation that takes place. And it's interesting trying to exit someone from that. And I remember working with one girl who was being taken from town to town. She'd been drugged with GHB. For those who use liquid ecstasy, it has a hypno type effect. It's like a date rape drug. And she jumps out of a moving car. And I go out 3 o'clock in the morning to accident emergency, because that's the way that, you know, street type agencies work. We don't have hours. If groomers are working 24/7, 365 days a year, and they will go into ungoverned spaces where many of our agencies don't go, then we also have to go into those spaces. And we also have to connect, not in the physical space, but more importantly in the emotional space. So I'm there, I'm talking to her, and I'm saying, look, it's about time now, this is it. You know, you've jumped out of a car, you're injured, you know, this guy who's grooming you, you know, he doesn't care about you, he's using and abusing you, and they're discarding you. And she says, yes, I'm going to leave, I'm going to leave, I'm going to leave. And as soon as she sobered up in the morning, when I went to pick her up in the morning, she went straight back to them. She went straight back to them, because this is the draw. He loves me. He cares about me. The buzz that she gets out of that. And this is what I always say at Street. We always say, if young people can be inspired towards evil, surely they can be inspired towards good. It's our failure in the mainstream that we don't connect with young people today. So I'm taking a different perspective, because I think the speakers have covered a lot of what I was going to say. Shada's completely stolen my thunder. I can talk for England, really, actually. I never thought I'd meet a female equivalent, but you know, it's a bit of a battle on here. But we're dealing with, obviously, a very, very serious matter. And it's good to be here with yourselves, because this is a safe space, and we need to have an honest discussion. No holds barred. We need to talk honestly about the future of our children. Can we continue the same way in the next 10 years with the paradigms that we're talking about? And I'm going to talk about some of those urban paradigms. And you saw about the reality of the sexualization of our young people, and the impact on girls in terms of body image, and the fact that they hate themselves when they're going through the most critical change in their life in puberty, and how groomers know exactly how to exploit that vulnerability. But in the same way, boys go through the same thing. I call it a crisis of masculinity. And part of that crisis of masculinity is one of the simple things that young men today think it is acceptable to use and abuse and discard women and girls. And this is a paradigm which is it's coming to your town soon, if not here already. And most of us are oblivious because the spaces which it's occurring are spaces that we don't inhabit. So come into our world. If you're a street, and I say, find out who the street workers are. I know some of them in this room who are right there at the front line where the vulnerability is. And walk the streets at 1 o'clock or 2 o'clock in the morning. I did a piece of work in Oxford, actually, part of Bullfinch, after Bullfinch, and I spoke to young people. And I spoke to young people about, obviously, sexual exploitation and sexual violence. And some of the things which emerged from that, and this is the reality of the society we're living in. First was, the reality, and it was so nonchalant, and I get this a lot with the young men I work with as well. Oh yes, that happens. Oh yes. It's the normalization of extreme levels of sexual violence. And let's talk about the reality. Children being gang raped in every orifice by multiple males. Young men thinking that is something which is normal. And you've got to ask yourself what's happening at a social and a psychological level in terms of an acceptance and a normalization of sexual violence and a trivialization of rape. As has already been mentioned, 1 in 3 women globally. I think when we say 1 in 3 women globally, it doesn't really kind of sometimes resonate. That's 1 billion women in the world. It's a global epidemic that's taking place. And we need to create a new paradigm. We've got to retweak masculinity, for example. We've got to realize that it's young men today think it is cool to own and possess women. That they're entitled because I bought her a £5 top-up to use and abuse her. That, power and status, being top dog, is through violence, is through conspicuous materialism, and through having, like I said, the ownership of girls and women. I call it the Grand Theft Auto paradigm because that's the reality of art imitating life. That's the reality, because we've got to ask ourselves, where are the alternative and positive male role models for these young men? Where are they? Where is there a role model out there in society of a young person, a young man who goes out into his environment and he goes out to safeguard, to protect, to show compassion, generosity, to look after the weak? Where's that game? Has anyone got that game? And would that video game actually sell any copies? And until we start making it cool, really, for guys to protect and respect women as their equals, then things aren't going to change. And the current paradigm we're going to see is just going to evolve further and further. Today we're here to show solidarity also with the oppressed, with those people who have been abused. And this is so important. And I'm so glad, as a person who's been working on this agenda for many years, and has also been ignored and avoided. Because people weren't prepared to listen to us, because they saw that the worlds in which we are involved, they saw us as dysfunctional because we work with dysfunctional kids and damaged kids. That they're making their own choices. How can a 12-year-old who hasn't got a father, who's out, a young man out on his streets, maybe he's come from a conflict zone himself, out there, really make his own choice? Someone who's deeply traumatized, even maybe suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, make their own choices. They're parenting themselves and they're educating themselves. And their peers are their kind of primary influence. So those voices were ignored, and we're showing solidarity with the children who have been abused. This is so important. Not just now, but this has gone on for absolute decades. This is not, child sexual exploitation is not something which is new. CSE is something which has been taking place for millennia. And the reality is that it's taking place now, around us, 24/7, 365 days. Highly sophisticated individuals who know exactly how to exploit vulnerability, and they know exactly what that vulnerability is. And there are out there channels at the moment where there are vulnerable young people in the physical space, in the emotional space, in the online space. And those individuals are there, and they are pulling them towards themselves. Like I said, that girl, we weren't able to provide a push away from abusive behavior. We weren't able to do that. That's how powerful. I can't explain to you the gravitational pull towards, the at-risk behavior. The only thing is, unless you are actually in that physical space, actually in that channel where young people are being pulled towards exploitation and abuse, we will always lose the battle. And that's why I am always going to be a champion, and this is my rant for the third sector, for street-based organisations. You see, with austerity and cuts, you know, we're losing frontline services, and we have actually decimated our youth service around the country. And in addition to that, third sector agencies who do street-based work, whether and I've worked with projects which are ex-working girls, ex-street workers, ex-gang members, and most of my workers are actually ex-gang members and people who have come from a particular lifestyle. Okay, whether it's street pastors or street angels, people who put themselves out there in that physical space and have credibility. Unfortunately, we are not supporting one of our major, you could say, weapons against child sexual exploitation, and we have to start thinking about prevention. It's the most important thing. Not just prevention, early intervention, to intervene as early as we possibly can to protect our young people. Because, so I want you to imagine, once a child goes through the level of abuse that we're talking about, their lives are destroyed irrevocably. And it's not acceptable. I hear a lot about multi-agency hubs and this and that, and all that is good stuff. But you're working post-abuse. And we've got to be thinking about, you know, stopping abuse right, preventing it right, you know, from its onset. And in order to do that, we've got to move out of our safe parameters, and we've got to go into these dangerous spaces and these hard to reach spaces, and we've got to engage with the people who can really directly connect with them. And we've got to make the resources available to them. The nature of CSE, as you've heard, is that the victims come from all backgrounds. And black, white, Asian. The interesting thing, however, about the victims is that many of the victims are invisible. And they're invisible because, again, sometimes the stereotypes we create fixate on particular models. That's why the stereotypes out there do not protect children. Our primary objective here, as all of us have to work together, is to protect and safeguard our children and the next generation. That's our most critical objective here. If we create unhelpful stereotypes, it won't work. I was working with a safeguarding agency where they said, we haven't got a grooming problem. And I said, okay, I'm surprised. You know, that you're probably one of the only authorities in the country that... He said, we haven't got a grooming problem because we haven't got any Pakistanis here. and I was kind of like taken aback because, now this is a frontline worker, this is a practitioner. I was amazed. And again, it just goes to show you, unfortunately, the stereotyping, how it impacts. It does not protect children because people fixate on one model. The nature of child sexual exploitation, I work around the country, is this, that the model here in Middlesbrough is different to the model in Durham. It is unique in every space. The players, the punters, how the tricks of the trade, the methods are used, the online methodology, everything is unique to every single area. And it reflects the demographics of every area. And the abusers come from all backgrounds. You know, and again, there are, you know, as I said, victims who are invisible. So in London, for example, many of the black children that I work with, we hardly get any convictions of African and Caribbean girls or girls coming forward to say that they have been sexually exploited. We're not getting them. In fact, what was happening instead is because those girls are caught up in this nexus of criminality, because they've got no choice. They're raped, they're criminalized, they're holding drug money, drugs, and weapons. And so too often we see girls going to prison. Because can they snitch? And I'll come back onto that. Because again, this is a kind of, you could say, a silo way of working. You know, in London everyone's obsessed with gun and knife crime and drug issues, and they don't address CSE. In other parts it's forced marriage and FGM, and again, you know, individuals who are victims of other types of abuse are invisible. So we have to work holistically here as well. In the same way as has already been mentioned, there is a massive wall of silence when it comes to certain institutions and certain communities. A massive wall of silence in terms of sexual abuse. And behind that, there are people who are complicit. And that gives the abusers impunity to operate. And it's happened in media, it happens in religious organisations, it happens in socially conservative communities. And we've got to break down those walls of silence. Because those walls of silence mean that individuals are complicit with the abuse and the exploitation of children. And no matter what those communities are. So we have to be looking beyond the CSE issue, we've also got to be looking at intra-family and intra-community sexual abuse. And we've got to be recognising, are we protecting our children? So the nature of abuse is changing all the time. And just to give you an idea, the space in which it operates is always morphing. If I give you an idea of how dynamic that change is, it's by the minute and by the hour. That's the reality of the change that takes place. It takes minutes to organise a party house where a girl will be taken, children will be taken, boys as well, and will be gang raped. Literally minutes. It took minutes for a revenge rape of a 12-year-old, okay, because her sister was going to snitch, so 10 boys came and raped her under a stairwell on an estate with bystanders watching. It took minutes for that to happen. This is what's happening in the reality of what's going on in our world. And we, unfortunately, are working on weeks and months. You know, we're working on completely different, okay, you know, like I said, timescales. And I just want people to realise that in a week, a sexually exploited child, in a week, is probably going to be raped about 100 times. As a worker says, I'll see you next week. Hope everything's going to go fine. And again, this is all about connecting with the most vulnerable children in our society. And it's kind of bizarre. And I also work on extremism, some of you might realise. So I'm working most of my time on sex and violence, and it's kind of like a lot. And it's the same sport, it's just grooming in a different model. But with regards to, you know, the same thing, how is it possible for sociopathic, psychotic individuals to connect with young people, inspire and motivate them more than us in the mainstream? And that's why Rotherham and all the cases we talk about, it's not about blaming the other, it's about every single one of us recognising we have a role and a responsibility here. 1,400 children in Rotherham. You know, I've got to say, as a street worker, you know, if you've got 10 children who fall through the net, that's bad enough. You know, and like I said, we get disclosures. On the street, we get a disclosure in 5 minutes. Someone would, and that's why our young people, we make them assets. They become our eyes and ears on the street. They tell us what's happening and disrupt and intervene and interject. Now, the challenge is that connecting with young people in terms of how is it possible that we can't inspire young people towards good when, you know, when we find groomers are out there and they're able to inspire young people. Anyway, let's move on. One of the kind of nexus that we work with is this nexus of drug supply, organised criminality and pimping and trafficking of children and girls. We know this occurs in every town and city around the country. And this is part of our disruption work. And we know that young men in particular, and this is our prevention work with young men, we know, and this is part of the crisis of masculinity, that young men aspire to be part of that nexus. Because they see the individuals involved in that, and this is part of the poverty of aspiration that they have, as their positive role models. They see these violent, powerful men as people that they aspire to. They see them with the cars, they see them with the clothes, they see them with their wealth and their bling. And they see them with the girls, and they make an equation. It's part of it that if I have all of this, or I'm a part of this, then it means, okay, I am someone who has status and significance, kudos in my particular environment. And so, knowing this, you know, what we have to do is an important part of our work is actually disrupting this process. So it's intervening directly and preventing young men from going into that particular nexus. Now, as has been identified, sexual violence is a global phenomenon. It's happening everywhere. So therefore, you know, focusing on one group really detracts from addressing the issue. And I won't go through all of this, but I will focus on this particular image, because it's part of the work that I do around, you know, sexual violence and the racialization of sexual violence. You know, this is an image from the Nazi era, and it's some of the propaganda images that were used. Now, if this image, obviously all of us, I'm sure in this room, would say that that image is completely unacceptable. You know, it's a despicable representation. It's a racial caricaturing of someone of a Jewish background, and the implication is that the grooming and the kind of exploitation of a white Aryan woman. This is exactly part of the Nazi propaganda, and it takes place actually across lots of cultures, yeah, about blaming the other and about this, the racialization of sexual violence. And again, I'm sure everyone in this room knows that sexual violence is not about race or religion. In fact, the individuals have completely extricated themselves from that, from any belonging to any group, even the human race. The reality is that sexual violence is about power and exploiting vulnerability. And it's about entitlement, as has been mentioned, and it's about impunity, the walls of silence, being quiet when people abuse, and therefore people being complicit with that process. And again, unfortunately, this is why you know, the far right has kind of exploited this particular issue. And again, this is why it's so important as a collective for all of us to say, this is unacceptable. That we see the demonization of one community, because this affects all of our community cohesion. And again, it does not protect children. Nazir Razal, I won't talk about it again, similarly, he's done the review nationally in terms of child exploitation, and he says, again, the figures, what they show is that there is no racial or ethnic basis to it. But I really want to, because time is short, I want to talk about one of the models that we work with. Again, that somehow, you know, and it is coming, you know, to your town soon, if it's not here already. Again, because we fixate on some models, we forget that there are many models, and this is peer-to-peer child sexual exploitation. This is children raping children. And this is what I said about the normalisation. When I spoke to the young people in Oxford, they said this is a norm. Oh, that happens. And what they said was that nothing will change. That's the challenge. They said nothing's going to change. It's going to continue to happen. And that's the kind of, you know, the loss of hope and the cynicism, you could say, because young people have been waiting for us to actually do something. Like I said, for years, for decades. If you look at the historic sexual abuse in the 70s and 80s, that was endemic in children's homes. We're talking about tens of thousands of children who have been sexually abused. And nothing was done about it. So there's a major, as we've been talking about, cultural shift that what needs to take place. And when I talk to the young men, and all these young men think that they are completely entitled to have sex with any of the girls within the gang. And they become self-fulfilling for the girls as well, because they realise that I have to accept sexual violence. And a lot of this is about self-esteem, and I'm going to come on to that in a minute. I have to accept sexual violence in order to be accepted by the group. And it's the complete kind of lack of moral compass, where young men say, all we want is sex. We don't care how we get it, who we get it from, but that's all we get. And just to give you an idea of some of the aspects of peer-to-peer, children aging from 11 to 18, gang affiliations and rivalries, okay, children who leave the care sector living in independent venues are then targeted for party houses. It's an escalation of bullying. There's a new type of bullying that we're seeing in schools. And that involves sexting. We just had a case this week in Bradford where one school, the naked image of a girl in that school, a South Asian girl in that school, was circulated to everyone through WhatsApp and various other social media and Snapchat. And, you know, and again, it's been done to punish that particular group. There's no grooming involved with peer-to-peer exploitation. It's straight to rape and straight to abuse. And again, we find compounded associations. These young people are not just being sexually abused, they're also involved in violence, in criminality, in drug supply, in organised criminality, and various other things. There are bystanders there. And the bystanders feel that they are powerless to challenge the powerful individuals within those groups. And we don't, you know, and they haven't got the skills to stand up for it. And social media is a major part of what drives the whole process. As I said, linked to it is the trivialization of rape. And young men, when I ask young men about rape, and we've got to create these safe spaces in education where we have these honest discussions about pornography, about gonzo porn, about the humiliating, degrading genres of pornography there which depict rape. You know, when I have a session and young guys say to me in a session, can I have sex with two girls at the same time? Can I make her gag? Can I use a dildo? Those are outrageous things that 12, 13-year-olds are telling you. But to me, that is a result. As an absolute result, that's exactly the kind of honest discussion that I want to have with young people. And then I can ask them, well, where did you get this from? And why do you think this is acceptable behaviour? And what is your primary source of education? And they'll say, it's the internet, it's our friends, it's our peer group, it's the street. And there's no counter-narrative to that. And that's why there's a trivialization of rape. But more worse than that, I want to dwell on this case and then kind of move on to solutions. Okay, this is something that is happening in schools up and down the country at the moment. Yet most schools, I have to say, turn a blind eye. Because most schools are not prepared to accept that there is a problem within the school around sexual violence, around sexual bullying. Because they don't want to be labelled as a school like that. They don't want to be Ofsteded as a school with a sexual violence problem. But I go to schools up and down the country to deal with this particular damage. In year 8, a boy who sat behind me in English class would try to unhook my bra through my shirt every day in the hallway. He would come up behind me, grab my breast. He thought it was hilarious. Teachers overlook this because they don't want to deal with the can of worms which comes after this. Peer groups, okay, other men ignore it. And everyone thinks it's funny and it's a joke. But I know exactly where this year 8, this 11-year-old is heading. Unless we intervene. Unless we do that intensive work with that individual around social, moral and legal boundaries, around basic respect. And one of the golden rules I always use, as I mentioned, what if this was your sister, your daughter, your mother, your female relative? And then you see the double standard, well, that would be outrageous. But then why are you doing this to someone else's sister, daughter, mother? And that's again one of the points I just kind of come back onto. You know, even in the language, you know, these are our children. I don't even like that. I hear practitioners often saying, othering them, those children, these children. No, they are our children. Until you really recognize that this is, you know, that one child being abused is one child too many. And when we allow an abuser to continue to abuse and we don't challenge them, you are putting your own children at risk. When you really internalize it in that way, then you see the cultural shift that takes place. So we need to intervene with this young guy. And we need to make sure we can't just let him continue, because if he continues, then he's going to end up like Bilal Khan at age of 13, who raped a 20-year-old, who knocked her down, orally raped her, robbed her in front of bystanders, and didn't think anything of it. And having worked in Stoke with some of the officers who were involved, they said this kid wasn't a monster. But what was going on in that headspace? Not just, like I said, it's across the board, not just with the, it's the wrong presentation by the way, but it's across the board. But again, moving on, when I have my safe space discussions with young people, young men in particular, one of the things they will always say to me is that women are asking for it. She deserves a slap. And what this is there's some interesting things with this. One, it shows the normalization of violence. The fact that they see rape as a crime which is committed by strangers who are violent, that pull women into bushes and sexually assault them. I'm not raping someone because this is, okay, you know, I'm entitled to do this. So they don't see this as behavior that they are actually involved in. So not only have they normalized violence themselves, but it's the other thing is that their peer group are complicit. They are, and young guys say to me, you know, I know this is wrong, but I can't bring myself to challenge the group think and to challenge the top dogs. Then I'll be victimized. And this is part of a long, bigger kind of talk that I do, which is about the crisis of masculinity. Because what we're doing with masculinity at the moment is that you hear, as a young man growing up, without positive male role models, and we've got to realize young people are parenting themselves, and the role models just aren't out there, and the counter-messaging just isn't out there. And then you're told when you're growing up, and everyone will know this, is a man in this room will know, be a man. Don't be a pussy. Don't cry, don't show weakness, suppress your emotion. Don't be emotionally supportive towards other people. It's weakness that you show compassion and love towards another person. And so young men are suppressing that emotion now. And their own moral compasses are being misdirected. Even though they want to speak out, they're not speaking out. And finally, for girls out there, they're accepting that I have to accept. In order to be part of the in crowd, to be accepted, then it's enough. And I just want to say, I've got a short period of time, this is us going back absolute decades in terms of basic rights. People ask me, why do I do this work? You do this work because it affects, you know, kids from Pakistani or Muslim backgrounds. No, I do what I want to do because this is about basic dignity for all of us in society. Because this affects every single one of us. And because these are our children that we have to affect. And that, you know, if we allow these paradigms to continue, as I said, they'll affect everyone. Whether it's rape culture, it goes on. I do want to talk about solutions and the way forward. Okay, and I just want to finish with our street kind of format quickly. We've got to be out there in the hard-to-reach spaces. We've got to be working where, you know, not in safe parameters, not in our 9-to-5 offices, not with the individuals, we've got to get out there and connect with young people in the physical spaces where they are vulnerable. It's a dangerous space to be. And that's why, you know, my workers are not qualified workers. The people who work with street, and I said it's not just street, but projects like, we're not qualified workers. Okay, in fact, most of my guys would not even get a job in most statutory agencies because they probably won't get past the criminal check. You know, I remember one of my workers, and it's an amazing story, he showed me, I got his CRB back. He said, oh, it was only one line at the bottom, that's not too bad. He said, no, turn it over. It was a full kind of page on the back. But he can get out there in those spaces and connect with those young. He knows that world, and he has credibility in that world. And he's able to pull people away, okay, from the gravitational pull towards abuse. We've got to have safe spaces where young people can come and report to us, because that's the big thing. Ask a young person out there, will they go to social services or the police to talk about the abuse that they're involved in? Will they do that? And they're very unlikely to do that. And so therefore we've got to create the environments where they feel that they can come and disclose and be open about it. And that means getting out in the streets to do that and putting the resources in there to do it. Sports and recreation we've touched on. It's a brilliant hook to engage young people and then to have the conversation with them. Involving our communities, empowering our communities, listening to our communities. Too often what we do is pay lip service to consultation and partnership work. We say, oh, we want to work with communities. But what it is that we actually just want them to give us information and that's it. We don't empower them. And more importantly, working with families and listening. You know, I told you that a family who has a child who's been sexually exploited, it's devastating. Absolutely devastating that the child you brought up is being pimped and exploited, is drug dependent and is being abused and no one is listening. And then I had one family where a child was exploited from the age of 16 and then after 18 the agencies turned around, oh, we can't do anything now, she's an adult. It's absolutely devastating. So again, early intervention means that we intervene as early as possible. We empower the mothers, we empower families, so that when they feel that their children have risk issues, that they're able to be supported as early on as possible. Just give you a bit of a taster of some of our work. Thank you.